course, as we've been going over the book of Galatians, we understand that there's this battle going on here against false teaching. And Paul has said, and will say again, that when they say that they've accepted Christ, and yet they start to fall into this teaching that in order for that to be complete, they have to be circumcised and they have to fulfill all the law of Moses, then they are putting themselves back under bondage, right? And I couldn't help but think about Galatians here as we sang that song, I'm Saved, because that is, again, a very definite statement. That is, I'm saved. Man, hallelujah. The Lord Jesus Christ died for my sins, and I am saved. I am redeemed. I am redeemed. And Paul has repeatedly told them, like, man, what began in the Spirit, you can't finish in the flesh. You have been redeemed. You have been bought and paid for. You have been adopted as a child of the King. Why are you going to go put yourself back under this bondage and this yoke? Man, fight against that, right? Fight against that false teaching. And in Galatians chapter 4, I would kind of divide this up 4 different ways. The first part is he's going to talk to them about how they have been adopted as children of the King. But in that, he's going to give them an example, because again, he is talking about the law compared to the grace of Jesus Christ. And he gives them an example of a child, and then he reminds them that they have been adopted. Starting in verse 8, he's going to talk to them about, again, remember a lot of these were Gentiles versus Jews, and he's going to talk to them about how that you getting back, maybe not back is not the right word, you getting into this thing about circumcision and trying to completely fulfill the law of Moses is really not much different than the bondage you were in before you knew about the Lord Jesus Christ as a pagan, and the festivals and the feasts and all of the things that you were trying to serve back then. He is going to talk to them about how that these false teachers are causing them to be zealous for the wrong things, and that being zealous is good, but you need to be zealous in the right way. And then he's going to end the chapter by giving them an example of whether you are a child of the bondwoman or a child of the free woman. And he would say this a different way. Are you a child of promise or a child of works? Which one are you? And he's going to give them the example of Hagar and Sarah. And again, we are still on the same topic, right, that we started at the beginning. He is preaching to them about the difference between salvation by grace through faith alone versus thinking it's Christ plus what else I have to do, right? All right, so let's read this whole chapter, and then we'll go verse by verse as we study through this. Galatians chapter 4, starting in verse 1. Now I say that the heir is, as long as he is a child, differeth nothing from a servant, though he be Lord of all, but is under tutors and governors until the time appointed of the Father. Even so we, when we were children, were in bondage under the elements of the world. But when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. And because ye are sons, God hath sent forth the Spirit of his Son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Wherefore thou art no more a servant, but a son, and if a son, an heir of God through Christ. Howbeit then, when ye knew not God, ye did service unto them which by nature are no gods. But now after that ye have known God, or rather are known of God, how turn ye again to the weak and beggarly elements, whereunto ye desire again to be in bondage? Ye observe days and months and times and years. I am afraid of you, lest I have bestowed upon you labor in vain. Brethren, I beseech you, be as I am, for I am as ye are, and ye have not injured me at all. Ye know how, through infirmity of the flesh, I preached the gospel unto you at the first, and my temptation which was in my flesh ye despised not, nor rejected, but received me as an angel of God, even in Christ Jesus. Where is then the blessedness ye speak of? For I bear you record that if it had been possible, ye would have plucked out your own eyes and given them to me. Am I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth? They zealously affect you, but not well. Yea, they would exclude you that ye might affect them. But it is good to be zealously affected, always in a good thing, and not only when I am present with you. My little children, of whom I travail in birth again until Christ be formed in you, I desire to be present with you now and to change my voice, for I stand in doubt of you. Tell me, ye that desire to be under the law, do ye not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondmaid and the other by a free woman. But he who was of the bondwoman was born after the flesh, but he of the free woman was born by promise. Which things are an allegory? For these are the two covenants, the one from Mount Sinai, which gendereth to bondage, which is Agar. For this Agar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answereth to Jerusalem, which now is, and is bondage with her children. But Jerusalem, which is above, is free, which is the mother of us all. For it is written, Rejoice, thou barren that bearest not. Break forth and cry, thou that travailest not. For the desolate hath many more children than she which hath an husband. Now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are the children of promise. But as then he that was born after the flesh persecuted him that was born after the Spirit, even so it is now. Nevertheless, what saith the Scripture? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free. And we'll get into all that here in a little bit. But again, think about those divisions. He's still talking about, are you under the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ, or are you still in bondage to the condemnation of the law? Which one is it, right? And then he gives us those examples at the end. But the first example he gives us in verse 1, Now I say that the heir, as long as he is a child, differeth nothing from a servant, though he be Lord of all, but is under tutors and governors until the time appointed of the father. Now, by the way, in the prior chapter is where we see the verse that talked about that the law was our schoolmaster to bring us to Christ, right? And I told you then that that word schoolmaster was this idea, and especially in the Roman and the Greek world, that the father might assign a tutor, and that person was in subjection to that tutor, right? And that tutor they couldn't go anywhere, do anything, leave the house, or without that tutor being there to guide them. Well, now you're into chapter 4, and it's expanding on that a little bit more, saying, hey, you know what? The rightful heir, the son, the child, right? Man, when he's a child, he really differeth nothing from a servant, though he be Lord of all. Now, I want you to think about this. We'll take an extreme case. Maybe it's not the extreme case, really. So you think about this. You got the king, and the king's got his children, the heirs to his kingdom, right? But he says while they're little children, and they've been assigned a tutor, they're really more like servants. They're not really any different, right? Even though technically they're the heirs of the kingdom, so they're really lord of all of it. But while they're children, they're led by the hand wherever they go. They're guided. They've got somebody there overseeing them. that's helping them think through things, that's helping them make decisions, that's really kind of supervising them. And if you think about it, even though they're technically heirs, even though they're the ones that are it, right? They're really still just like servants. They are under the tutor, under the guidance, the counsel of somebody else. He says in verse 3, even so we, when we were children, were in bondage under the elements of the world. We were in bondage to the elements of the world. I think back again, oftentimes, to that book of John where he tells them, you're in bondage. Oh, we're not in bondage. We're Abraham's seed. No, you are in bondage to sin. You are in bondage to sin. And don't you know that the law is showing you that? And it is that guide, that tutor that's just like, You can't take a step to the left or a step to the right without that tutor going, nope, don't do that. Nope, don't do that. Nope, can't do that. Nope, stop that. And you're in bondage. But he says in verse 4, but when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. He said, you were like little children that were basically like servants, and you had this guide, this tutor, and it was watching every step you took. But God sent his Son, who died on the cross, who was born of a woman under the law, and yet he was the one and only that completely and totally, perfectly fulfilled that law. And he gave himself that you and I could have forgiveness of sins, adopted as children, set free from the bondage of sin. Just like as a child that comes of age and is now no longer under that tutor, that guide that is standing there constantly saying this. But man, you have been redeemed. You've been forgiven. You've been adopted as a son. By the way, he is speaking probably a mixed group of people, both Jews and Gentiles. But if you're a Gentile, and you are, man, think about that, right? Especially these people. They weren't born under the Mosaic law. They weren't born under that. They were outside that circle. They were steeped in paganism and idolatry and all this other stuff. And yet, Apostle Paul comes along and says, through the work of the shed blood of Jesus Christ, man, you have been adopted as a son. You're a child of the King. You're a child of the King. And then he says in verse 6, and because ye are sons, God hath sent forth the Spirit of his Son unto your hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Wherefore thou art no more a servant, but a son. And if a son, then an heir of God through Christ. He says, through the work of Jesus Christ, you are an heir to the throne. You are a child of the King. You're no longer a servant, but you're a child of the King. You're an heir. You're an heir to the King. Listen, all of it's so neat in this. You see the work of the Son. You see the work of the Father. You see the work of the Holy Spirit. He says, hey, because you're a son, he sends forth his Spirit into your heart, crying, Abba, Father. You know what? In the fullness of time, in the Lord's time, he calls you, and you respond through the calling of the Holy Spirit, and you recognize him as your Father. You see there the work of the Trinity in those three examples, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. He goes through that, and then in verse 8, he says, "Howbeit then?" You see, that's a questioning statement. If these things are true, why is it that you're doing this? He reminds them of the gospel message that he had first brought to them. He reminds them of the work of the Lord Jesus Christ. And then he says, "Howbeit then, when ye knew not God, ye did service unto them which by nature are no gods." He says, what were you before? What were you before? Man, you were in service and bondage to those false gods. But verse 9, "But now, after that ye have known God, or rather are known of God, how turn ye again to the weak and beggarly elements wherein ye desire again to be in bondage? Ye observe days and months and times and years. I am afraid of you, lest I have bestowed upon you labor in vain." We know there's some other places in Galatians where he says that he does have confidence in them. And I think what he's saying there is, I think you are going to recognize the error of your ways, because when I was with you, I saw what the Lord did in you, and I have confidence that you're gonna get this figured out. He says that in chapter 6, I think. But when he's here, he's saying, listen, man, I came and I labored with you guys. And it seemed as if the Lord had opened your eyes and he'd redeemed you and he'd purchased you and you got it and you were zealous for him. And you came out of all of that other stuff, all of that paganism and all that idolatry and all of that. Honestly, if you've ever studied any kind of paganism and the idolatry stuff, man, you want to talk about a fear-based, works-based type system. Man, they were afraid of those gods, because those gods that they believed in, man, they were fickle, and there was it was absolutely, you had to keep them pleased, or who knows, they might just come wipe out your crop or wipe out this or wipe out that. Listen, they were in bondage to the service to those things. And I think he is here reminding them that you got out of that. You recognized the work of the Lord Jesus Christ, and you were redeemed, and you saw that you were no longer in bondage to that idolatry and all of those feasts and those festivals and all that other stuff that you had to do. And man, you remember the liberty and the freedom of that. But now don't you realize that when you let these false teachers come in and you let them start to teach, oh, by the way, now you have to do circumcision, and now you have to do this, and now you have to do this, and now you have to do this, and if you want this to be right, if you want this to be real, you got to do this. He says, don't you realize that you're putting yourself back under the same bondage that you were in before? And he said, I'm afraid of you, lest I have bestowed upon you a labor in vain. There's a couple places here in this book where he basically tells them he's starting to doubt them. He's starting to doubt them. Actually, he even uses that word here in a little bit. Starting to doubt you. If you're accepting these things, and if you're teaching these things, and you're promoting these things, was my labor among you in vain? And then verse 12, brethren, I beseech you. That beseech there is this idea of to plead with, to invite near. Be as I am, for I am as ye are. Ye have not injured me at all. He says, man, listen, me and you, we're in the same boat. Hey, you know what? Paul wasn't once in bondage to things. He was even zealous about those things. But the grace of Jesus Christ made a difference in his life. They were once in bondage to paganism and all of that stuff that went with it. But through the shed blood of Jesus Christ, they've been redeemed. And both Jew and Gentile, right, are the same. He says in verse 13, "You know how through infirmity of the flesh I preached the gospel unto you at the first." You know, he's telling them, hey man, we are the same. And by the way, you know, I love you guys. I love you guys. You're not injuring me, man. You are injuring the work of the Lord Jesus Christ here. But then he starts to remind them of the time that he was with them and how that when he was with them, man, he was willing to go through infirmities in order to bring them the gospel, in order to teach them and to disciple them. He was willing to go through much. But he also talks to them about how they accepted that. "And my temptation, which was in my flesh, ye despised not, nor rejected, but received me as an angel of God, even as Christ Jesus." He says, I went through a lot of affliction. And you know what? The things I went through and the struggles I had and the situations I was faced with and the marks on my body and the other things, man, you didn't despise those. But you accepted me. You accepted me as a messenger of God. And he's building up to something here. He even says in verse 15, "Where is then the blessedness ye spake of?" I think he's referring back to the relationship that he once had with them. They thought highly of him. They spoke blessedness of him and his ministry. He says, "For I bear you record that if it had been possible, you would have plucked out your own eyes and given them to me." He says, I remember the infirmities and the things I went through and the trials and the troubles and the temptations and how you were there and you accepted me as a messenger from God, and you even spoke blessedness of me and you thought highly of me, and you were even willing. I remember a time when you would have willingly sacrificed of yourself if it would be a help to me. And you would pluck out your own eyes and give them to me if you could. But then he says, "Am I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth?" He's saying, listen, I'm not your enemy. I know I called you, O foolish Galatians. I know I said I'm in doubt of you. I know that I said some of these things, but listen, man, I love you guys. I want the best for you. I want the right thing for you. Don't you remember the relationship that we had when I was there? Am I your enemy because I'm willing to stand up and tell you the truth? You know, there's some verses that indicate that a true friend is one that's willing to stand up and say what you need to hear. Versus the enemy is really the one that stands up and says what you want to hear. That's a pretty practical thing to keep in mind, guys. Now, we need to do it in the right heart and the right attitude, right? But listen, it is a biblical principle that if I am your friend, I will tell you if there's something that I think is going to harm you. And I will tell you the truth in love because I care about you. But those that don't care about you, they will tell you what you want to hear and let you go on your merry way until you fall off the edge of the cliff. He says, I'm not your enemy just because I'm telling you the truth. And then he says this, they zealously affect you, but not well. They zealously affect you, but not well. We need to be careful. We need to be careful. I believe, and when you finish out the book of Galatians, I think Paul believes too, he is talking to saved people. Maybe not every single one of them that reads this letter, but generally speaking, he is talking to saved people. But he tells them, you have been zealously affected the wrong way. We need to be careful of false teachers. If we think that we can't be impacted by false teachers, we need to step back and take a look at ourselves. Man, we need to be on guard. These people who had once been zealous for the Lord, zealous over Paul's ministry, were now considering him an enemy because he was telling them the truth. They were now zealously, apparently, pursuing some of these false teachings. And Paul is coming in and saying, guys, you need to wake up. It's okay to be zealous. Man, you need to make sure you're zealous for the right things. I shouldn't say this, but I'm going to. I have been listening to some stuff about some ranks within the independent Baptist groups. And listen, there are some within the independent Baptist ranks. They really are more about works and easy believism and some other stuff that I fundamentally disagree with, and they get very zealous about those things. But listen, you can be zealous about the wrong thing. Paul was zealous about the wrong thing before he was saved. He was zealous about the wrong thing. He tells them in verse 18, but it is good to be zealously affected, always in a good thing, and not only when I am present with you. He says, man, you need to be zealous for the right things. That's a good thing. Be zealous for the right things. Man, I just wish it wasn't that I had to be with you all the time in order for you to be zealous about the right things. Right? You need to be zealous about the right things even when I've been gone for a while. It says in verse 19, my little children of whom I travail in birth, again until Christ be formed in you, I desire to be present with you now and to change my voice, for I stand in doubt of you. Even he calls them his little children. And I don't think he's saying until they're saved. He's saying that until the teachings and the things of Christ are rooted and grounded in them, right? But he says, listen, man, it's like the way I feel for you guys and the way I want to toil for you guys is like a mother that's giving birth, man. There are pains of birth that go along with this, but that's how much I care for you. And I want what's good for you. I want to see Christ in you and solid, and you zealous over those things. But listen, man, I wish I was there right now, because I would stand before you and you would hear my voice changed, because I doubt you right now. He's saying, listen, when I was there before, you heard me speak to you, and it was in love and compassion, and man, it was great. You would have plucked your eyes out for me. Man, we had this great relationship. We had this great thing. But listen, the things I'm hearing about you now, if I was there present with you, I wish I was, because I would love to stand there and let you hear the tone of my voice in regards to, man, you guys got to change. I am in doubt of you. I could almost hear Paul saying, I wish you could hear the disappointment in my voice. I don't know about you guys, but listen, when I was little and I had done something I shouldn't have done, there were times when just to hear the disappointment in my parents' voice was enough to go, man. Why'd I do that? He's like, man, I wish you could hear my voice now. Because I'm in doubt of you. Something's wrong, guys. Something is wrong. And then he gets into this last half of the chapter where he starts to talk about, he says, tell me, ye that desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? He says, you guys that want to be under the law, you guys have heard this false teaching, and now you have this zeal and this passion to be under the law. He says, but don't you hear the law? Like, he says it in a couple different places here in Galatians. Even those that are trying to get you to do this, they can't even fulfill the law themselves. Do you hear the law? Do you hear what the law has said? See prior conversation about my bullet points about if you're under the law, you got to be under all of it. And if you're not able to fulfill all of it, you're actually cursed. He says in verse 22, for it is written that Abraham had two sons, the one a bondmaid, the other by a free woman. But he who was of the bondwoman was born after the flesh, but he of the free woman was by promise, which things are an allegory. For these are the two covenants, the one from Mount Sinai, which gendereth to bondage, which is Hagar. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answereth to Jerusalem, which now is, and is bondage with her children. But Jerusalem, which is above, is free, which is the mother of us all. For it is written, rejoice, thou barren that bearest not. Break forth and cry, thou that travailest not. For the desolate hath many more children than she which hath an husband. Now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are the children of promise. But as then he that was born after the flesh persecuted him that was born after the Spirit, even so it is now. Nevertheless, what saith the Scripture? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free. Now, if you go over the book of Genesis, I don't know if we're going to have time to do all this, but we could read this. Let me just give you a summary of the story of Hagar and Sarah, right? We'll summarize it because I don't think we have time to read. It's like 4 or 5 chapters is what this spans. But the story goes something like this, right? God comes to Abraham and tells him and gives him a promise, tells him that there's going to be this great nation that comes from him, that Sarah is going to bear and have children, and that there's going to be this promised seed. Makes a covenant with Abraham. Now, Abraham and Sarah are really probably already to this point in their life where they really aren't going to have kids. But God has promised they will. But after a little time goes by, Sarah basically comes to Abraham and says, I don't have any kids. Not gonna have kids. Why don't you take my handmaid Hagar, and you can have her as a wife, and you can have kids for me through her. I don't even know what to say about that, but that's what happened. Okay, so Abraham goes into Hagar. By the way, as soon as that's done, the dynamic between Hagar and Sarah and Abraham gets really weird. Imagine that. No surprise. Hagar doesn't think so highly of her mistress anymore, of her master. Her master doesn't think so great of Hagar anymore. And then to make matters worse, Hagar is pregnant, has a kid. Now Sarah, who wanted children, couldn't have them, didn't have them, even though God had promised there would be a child. Now her bondwoman has a child, which is Abraham's. And now you got all this contention. But God keeps coming along saying, Abraham, you're going to have a child. And Abraham says, I did have a child. It's Ishmael. And God says, no. I told you you're going to have a child through Sarah. Now Sarah hears it this time, and Sarah laughs. And the Lord confronts her. And she's like, I didn't laugh. And he's like, yeah, you did. Again, she is beyond the age of bearing children. Let me be more specific. This is physically impossible for her at this point. We're not just talking about she's old enough that it's going to be hard, it's going to be difficult, it's going to be unlikely. The Bible actually describes it as she was past the age of bearing children. And yet the Lord has just told them, you will have a child. And it's not going to be done the way you tried to do it. Because Abraham, the way you and Sarah tried to do it before, that was of the flesh, not of the promise. That's what happens when you try to do it your own way, Abraham. But I am telling you, you will have a child of promise. Do you know the difference between the two? One of them God alone can do. And one of them was Abraham trying to do it on his own. Remember, what's the context here? The context is whether or not your salvation comes through trying to perfectly fulfill the law, or whether it comes through the work of the Lord Jesus Christ. Is your salvation a salvation of promise or a salvation of works? Because you can try to do it the way Abraham did and do it on his own with a physical, realistic way of accomplishing it. Did Abraham find a way to have a child? Yeah. Was it the way God said it should be done? No. And start to understand that what Paul is drawing the picture for them in this passage is he's saying there's a way of the flesh and works, and there's a way of promise. You can't have it both ways. Do you want to be of the bondwoman, or do you want to be of the free woman? Because the free woman had her child through a miracle of God, a promise that God alone gave and God alone could fulfill. Or do you want to do it the other way? By the way, eventually, the son of the bondwoman was cast out because he wasn't of the promise. Now, we could go back and look at that story and, hey, God actually blessed Ishmael. And he had lots of kids, and he became a powerful nation. And that is actually a promise of God. God came to Hagar and said, this is going to happen because he is a child of Abraham. But in many ways, that even of itself is a reflection of the difference between the nation born of promise and the nation born of the works. And by the way, the nation born of works was actually a judgment and a rebuke from that time forward of the way Abraham tried to do it on his own. And he's telling us that's a true story that can be applied as an allegory to the concept of, do you want to be under the law or do you want to be under God's grace? Do you want to be under God's promise? Or do you want to be under the schoolmaster? Which one are you? And that's what he's telling them. Now in the next chapter, and we don't have time to get that one started obviously, but in the next chapter, he's going to start to get into, even though he has talked a whole lot about you're not under the law, you're not under the law, you're not under the law, you're under the Spirit of grace, you're under the Lord Jesus Christ, you're a child of the King, you've been adopted. In the next chapter, he is actually going to start talking about what it means to be not under the law, to be under the blessed promise of the Lord Jesus Christ, and yet what your life will reflect when you are under the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ. Because listen, some people would take what I have tried to declare over the last 4 chapters, and they would say, now you can just go live and do and be whatever you want to be. That's actually not even what Paul is saying. But he says, where is your salvation? Is your salvation of works, or is your salvation of grace? If your salvation of grace, then you're going to have the Spirit of God dwelling in you. And hey, there will be some fruits that are bore by that Spirit living and guiding in you. But that's not where your complete salvation comes from. That's not where your redemption comes from. Don't put yourself back under the bondage of the law. False teaching, listen, false teaching can spread quickly, and it can cause a lot of damage. It can cause a lot of damage. Paul has already described it that he needs to stand against this to protect the purity of the gospel, to keep it from being perverted. He's even described that the way that they're starting to do this, he's called them foolish. He says that I'm doubting you. And he's starting to say, man, was my labor in vain? Man, we need to be careful that we stand firm in the Scripture, stay faithful to it, and guard against false teaching, because it is damaging and it spreads quickly. Matter of fact, you'll find in the coming chapters a famous little verse that's used a couple times. A little leaven leaveneth the whole lump. Do you know he's actually going to quote that in context of what we're talking about? That's coming up here in the next few chapters. All right. Brother Philip, would you come and lead us in a song, please? We'll go ahead.